Judge Thomas Ellison adjusted the cuffs of his crisp navy suit and straightened his tie as he approached the grand courthouse steps. It was a ritual of his, one final moment to compose himself before stepping into the world of justice, where his word carried weight, where his decisions altered lives. At 63, he had spent nearly 3 decades on the bench, his reputation built on fairness, wisdom, and an unshakable belief in the law. But today, he wouldn't even make it through the courthouse doors before the law, twisted, ugly, and biased, turned against him. He had just reached the top step when he heard the voice behind him. "Hey, you. Hold it right there." It wasn't the voice of respect or recognition. It was the bark of authority laced with suspicion, the kind he had heard directed at young men in the streets, not men like him. He turned, slowly, deliberately, and found himself staring into the eyes of a uniformed officer, a white man, tall and broad-shouldered, his stance aggressive, his hand already resting on his holster. "What seems to be the problem, officer?" Judge Ellison asked, his tone calm but firm. "Problem?" The cop scoffed. "Yeah, I'd say we got a problem. We got a report about a suspect matching your description. You got ID." For a moment, Judge Ellison thought he had misheard. He searched the officer's face for some sign of recognition, some hint that this was a misunderstanding that would soon be corrected. But there was none. Just hostility, unchecked and unashamed. A suspect. The judge arched a brow. In what crime, exactly? Burglary. The officer's lip curled, as if the very word tasted foul in his mouth. "I don't suppose you'd just admit it and save us both some time, would you?" Ellison let out a slow breath. He had spent decades teaching young lawyers how to recognize bias in the system, how to fight it, how to rise above it. But knowing it existed and standing in the face of it were two very different things. "Officer," he read the name on the badge. "Reynolds, I believe you're making a mistake. I'm Judge Thomas Ellison, and I have court proceedings to oversee this morning. Now, if you'll excuse me." Reynolds let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Judge? Oh, that's rich." He took a step closer, invading Ellison's space. "You expect me to believe that? Come on, old man, don't make this harder on yourself." Ellison's hands curled into fists at his sides. Old man. There it was, an insult wrapped in condescension, an attempt to diminish him. He had encountered men like this before. Men who didn't need facts, only their own prejudices. Men who saw his skin and assumed they already knew everything about him. A few people had begun to gather near the courthouse entrance, murmuring amongst themselves, exchanging glances. Court clerks. Attorneys. Even a couple of journalists who had been setting up for a different case. The tension in the air was thick, the kind of tension that came before a storm. "I have identification in my briefcase," Ellison said, his voice steady. "If you'd allow me to retrieve it." "Nice try," Reynolds snapped. "Not reaching for anything. Hands where I can see him." The insult hit harder this time. The implication that he, a sitting judge, was a threat. The absurdity of it. But absurdity had never stopped injustice before. "This is unacceptable," Ellison said, the steel creeping into his voice. "You are detaining me without cause, despite my clear explanation of who I am." Reynolds scoffed again. "And I'm supposed to just take your word for it? How about we take a little walk downtown and clear this up?" Ellison felt a slow burn rise in his chest. "You are making a grave mistake, officer." Before Reynolds could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "Judge Ellison." A woman's voice, sharp and authoritative. Assistant District Attorney Rachel Morales hurried down the steps, her heels clicking against the stone. She was young but sharp, with a reputation for precision and an intolerance for incompetence. Her dark eyes locked onto Reynolds with something close to disgust. "What the hell is going on here?" she demanded. Reynolds shifted, clearly caught off guard. "I'm detaining a suspect." "A suspect? Are you out of your mind?" Morales practically spat the words. "This is Judge Ellison, one of the most respected judges in this state." She turned to the growing crowd. "Somebody get the Chief Justice on the phone. Now." The courthouse buzzed with hushed conversations. Court officials whispered to each other, eyes darting between Ellison and Reynolds. A court officer pulled out his phone. The shift was happening, the realization setting in. Reynolds, however, was still standing stiffly, jaw clenched, as if sheer arrogance could undo what he had just done. Ellison met his gaze, unwavering. "Do you see now?" For a split second, there was something in Reynolds' eyes. Not quite guilt, not yet, but doubt. The first crack in his certainty. Morales turned to Ellison. "Judge, are you all right? Do you want to file a complaint?" Ellison took a long breath. He had spent years preaching patience and dignity, even in the face of provocation. And yet, standing here, forced to defend his very identity, he felt something deeper than anger. A weariness. A frustration that stretched beyond himself. "I will deal with this in due time," he said finally. "For now, I have court to attend." And with that, he turned and walked past Reynolds, past the murmuring crowd, past the courthouse doors that should have never been closed to him in the first place. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The courtroom was silent as Judge Ellison took his seat behind the bench. He could feel the weight of eyes on him, some filled with concern, others with curiosity. Word of what had happened outside had spread like wildfire, and though the proceedings were about to begin, the atmosphere carried a thick undercurrent of unease. Rachel Morales took her place at the prosecution's table, her jaw still tight with anger. She had always admired the judge's composure, but even she could see the barely concealed irritation in his expression. He wasn't a man prone to outbursts, but this was different. Before calling the first case, Ellison exhaled slowly. He had spent decades ruling on injustices, but today he had been on the other side of it. The gavel in his hand felt heavier than usual. He glanced around the courtroom, seeing the quiet murmurs, the stolen glances. The tension was undeniable. The gavel struck once, a sound that commanded silence. "Bailiff, bring in the first case," he said, his voice steady. But the day was far from normal. Outside the courthouse, the media had picked up the story, headlines forming, narrative shaping. And across town, Officer Reynolds was realizing just how bad a mistake he had made. And it was only going to get worse for him. The courthouse was a world of its own, self-contained, its rhythm dictated by the proceedings within. But today, that rhythm was offbeat, the equilibrium shattered. The story of what had happened on the courthouse steps had spread through the legal community like wildfire, whispered in break rooms, discussed in hushed tones in hallways. It had even begun to leak beyond these walls, reaching journalists who thrived on controversy, on the stories that exposed the cracks in the system. Judge Thomas Ellison knew this. He could feel the undercurrents shifting, could see the stolen glances exchanged as he walked through the halls. Some people averted their eyes out of discomfort, as if embarrassed for the system itself. Others were filled with quiet rage, sharing his indignation. And some simply waited to see how it would all play out. Rachel Morales wasn't one of those people. As soon as the first recess was called, she stormed into his chambers without knocking. "Judge, we need to talk." Ellison sighed, removing his reading glasses and setting them down on his desk. "I take it this isn't about the case docket?" Morales scoffed. "The case docket? Are you serious?" "Judge, this isn't just some bad day at the office. The media is outside. Reporters are calling the DA's office nonstop. They want a statement. Hell, half the public defenders are already talking about filing a complaint against Reynolds." Ellison leaned back in his chair, fingers pressed together in thought. "And what do you think I should do?" Morales hesitated. "I think you should go on record. Make it clear that what happened today was unacceptable. Let them see that this is what we're up against." He regarded her carefully. "And what do you think that will accomplish?" "It will force their hand. The department can't sweep this under the rug. You have power, Judge. Use it." Ellison exhaled slowly. The anger was there, simmering beneath the surface, but so was caution. He had spent decades choosing his battles wisely. But this was not just about him. It was about every black man who had been stopped for no reason, every professional whose qualifications had been doubted, every person who had ever had to prove they belonged in a space that should have already been theirs. "I'll think about it," he said finally. "For now, I have a courtroom to run." Morales looked frustrated but nodded. "Just don't let them pretend this didn't happen." As she left, Ellison turned to the window, watching the press gather outside. A storm was brewing, and no amount of patience or dignity was going to stop it. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Reynolds was coming to terms with the magnitude of his mistake. Calls had already started coming in from superiors. His fellow officers had caught wind of the incident. And worse, his name was already being mentioned in the press. "You screwed up, Reynolds," his superior had told him over the phone. "And this time, you might not be able to talk your way out of it." Reynolds sat in his patrol car, gripping the wheel, feeling the weight of his career hanging by a thread. He had always been able to push the line, always been able to get away with bending the rules. But this was different. And for the first time in his career, he felt something unfamiliar: fear. By the time Judge Thomas Ellison returned to his chambers at the end of the day, the courthouse had become a media frenzy. Reporters crowded the front steps, cameras flashing, microphones shoved toward anyone willing to speak. Some of the courthouse staff had snuck out through side exits to avoid the spectacle, but Ellison had no such luxury. He was the center of the storm now, whether he liked it or not. He sank into the leather chair behind his desk, rolling his shoulders to release the tension building in them. He had spent the day dispensing justice as if nothing had happened that morning, as if the weight of racial profiling and public humiliation weren't still pressing against his chest. But it was there. It had been there all day. A knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in." Rachel Morales stepped inside, her expression unreadable. She held a stack of papers in one hand, her phone in the other. "Judge, I just got off the phone with a reporter from the Tribune. They're running the story tonight. It's already trending on social media." Ellison exhaled through his nose. He had expected as much. "They want a comment from you." He rubbed his temples. "And what would you suggest I say? That this kind of injustice is unacceptable. That even a sitting judge isn't immune to racial profiling. That the system has a disease, and the only way to fix it is to expose it." Ellison sighed. "Rachel, I appreciate your passion, but I've spent decades building my reputation on measured words and careful action. If I respond emotionally, they'll paint me as an angry black man. If I say nothing, they'll assume guilt or complicity." She shook her head. "Judge, you don't get to be neutral in your own story." He studied her for a long moment. There was fire in her eyes, a determination that reminded him of himself when he was younger. He had fought so many battles in his career, but perhaps this was one he could no longer ignore. Before he could answer, another knock sounded at the door. This time, it was the Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court, an older white man with a grave expression. "Thomas, may I have a word?" Rachel gave Ellison a glance before slipping out, closing the door behind her. The Chief Justice took a seat across from him. "We need to discuss what happened this morning." Ellison nodded. "I assumed as much. It's gaining traction. The governor's office has already reached out. There's pressure to make this go away." Ellison's jaw tightened. "And what exactly does 'make this go away' mean?" The older man sighed. "You know how this works. A quiet internal investigation. Some backdoor apologies. Maybe a short suspension for Reynolds. And then life moves on." Ellison leaned forward. "And if I refuse to let it go quietly?" The Chief Justice hesitated. "Then we have a public spectacle that could undermine trust in the system." Ellison gave a humorless laugh. "Trust? Trust for whom? I lost my dignity today on the courthouse steps, in front of my colleagues, in front of the very institution I serve. And now you're asking me to pretend it didn't happen." The Chief Justice's face remained neutral. "I'm asking you to consider the long-term consequences." Ellison exhaled, staring at the framed law degrees on his wall. He had always played the long game, always chosen strategy over emotion. But this wasn't just about him anymore. "No," he said finally. "This time, silence is not an option." The Chief Justice regarded him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Then I hope you're prepared for what comes next." As he left, Ellison sat back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The fire had already started. Now, all that remained was to see how far it would spread. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Reynolds was drowning in panic. The messages on his phone were relentless, calls from union reps, from department officials, from fellow officers who were distancing themselves. His name was everywhere. He wasn't just another cop accused of misconduct. He had insulted and detained a sitting judge, and now the entire world was watching. His fingers trembled as he scrolled through the online comments. They were brutal. This man shouldn't have a badge. How many innocent people has he done this to? Fire him. He tried to tell himself that it would blow over, that the department would back him, but deep down, he knew the truth. He had gone too far this time. And when the system needed a scapegoat, they wouldn't hesitate to make an example of him. His phone rang again. This time, it was his captain. He hesitated before answering. "Reynolds." A long pause. Then, "You need to come in. Now." His stomach twisted. This wasn't going away. It was only getting started. Judge Thomas Ellison barely slept that night. The weight of what had happened, of what was to come, sat heavy on his chest. He had spent years upholding the law, protecting its integrity, and now he found himself at the center of a battle that went far beyond him. By morning, his name was everywhere. News segments dissected the footage of his encounter with Officer Reynolds. Legal analysts debated the implications, and community leaders demanded action. By the time he arrived at the courthouse, it was chaos. Protesters lined the streets, some holding signs calling for police accountability, others defending law enforcement, claiming Reynolds had been just doing his job. Ellison tightened his grip on his briefcase as he walked through the throng, head held high, dignity intact. The cameras flashed, reporters shouted his name, but he said nothing. Not yet. Inside, Rachel Morales was waiting. "You need to see this," she said, thrusting a tablet into his hands. Ellison glanced at the screen. It was a statement from the police union, standing firmly behind Reynolds. They painted him as a good officer who had simply made a mistake, arguing that he had acted out of caution in a high-crime area. The implication was clear. Racial profiling wasn't the issue. The city's crime problem was. Ellison's jaw clenched. "So, they're doubling down." Rachel nodded. "And it's not just them. Some of the conservative networks are spinning this as an attack on law enforcement. They're saying you overreacted, that you're trying to make yourself a martyr." Ellison sighed. He had expected resistance, but seeing it laid out so plainly was infuriating. "And Reynolds?" he asked. Rachel smirked. "Oh, he's scrambling. The department put him on administrative leave pending an investigation. But between the public outrage and the internal pressure, it's only a matter of time before they cut him loose." Ellison took a deep breath. He wasn't naive. He knew the system protected its own. But this time, there were too many eyes watching. Too much momentum for them to sweep it under the rug. Just then, a knock on the door interrupted them. The bailiff stepped in, looking uneasy. "Judge, there's someone here to see you." Ellison arched an eyebrow. "Who?" The bailiff hesitated. "Officer Reynolds." Rachel stiffened. "Are you serious?" Ellison exchanged a glance with her before nodding. "Let him in." A moment later, Reynolds stepped inside, looking like a man on the verge of collapse. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by something resembling desperation. His eyes darted between Ellison and Rachel before settling on the judge. "Judge Ellison." He swallowed hard, shifting uncomfortably. "I came to apologize." Rachel scoffed. "Apologize? You mean now that your job's on the line?" Reynolds ignored her, focusing on Ellison. "I messed up. I let my own biases, my own assumptions, cloud my judgment. And I disrespected you. I know that now." Ellison studied him for a long moment. "And what do you expect me to do with this apology?" Reynolds exhaled sharply. "I don't know. I don't want this to be the thing that ruins my life." Rachel crossed her arms. "Funny, you weren't so concerned about ruining his." Ellison remained silent, watching the man before him. He could see the fear in Reynolds' eyes, not just fear of losing his job, but fear of losing the illusion of power he had always carried. Finally, Ellison spoke. "What you did was not just a mistake, Officer Reynolds. It was a symptom of a much bigger problem. And you are not the only one who has to reckon with that." Reynolds nodded slowly. "I understand." Ellison gestured to the door. "Then you need to go." Reynolds hesitated, as if he had hoped for something more, for absolution. But there was none to be given. He turned and walked out, shoulders slumped, knowing his reckoning was far from over. Rachel exhaled, shaking her head. "He doesn't deserve forgiveness." Ellison nodded. "No, but this isn't about him anymore. This is about what comes next." And as the protests outside grew louder, as the world continued to watch, Ellison knew that the fight for justice was only just beginning. The morning after Officer Reynolds' visit, Judge Thomas Ellison woke up to a storm brewing on every front. The city was divided. The courthouse steps had turned into a battleground of voices, some demanding justice, others crying foul at what they saw as an attack on law enforcement. News vans cluttered the sidewalks, their satellite dishes pointed skyward, reporters eager to dissect every new development. Inside the courthouse, Ellison made his way to his chambers, where Rachel Morales was already waiting, her expression tense. "You saw the headlines?" she asked, barely waiting for him to sit down. Ellison nodded. It was hard to miss. Rachel slid a folder across his desk. "It's worse than you think." Ellison opened it, his eyes scanning the pages. Internal reports, leaked emails, complaints that had been buried. It was a damning collection, all tied to Officer Reynolds. Excessive force allegations, improper conduct, racially charged remarks captured on body cam footage, but never addressed. A pattern clear as day. "They protected him," Rachel said, anger threading her voice. "Again and again. Until now." Ellison exhaled sharply. He had expected as much, but seeing it all in one place was sickening. The department knew. And they did nothing. Rachel nodded. "And that's just Reynolds. If we dig deeper, How many more like him are out there? Ellison leaned back in his chair, considering the weight of it all. This wasn't just about Reynolds anymore. It was about a system that enabled men like him, that allowed racism and abuse to fester unchecked. Just then, a sharp knock on the door interrupted them. The bailiff stepped inside, looking uneasy. "Judge, the mayor's office is on the line." Ellison exchanged a glance with Rachel before picking up the phone. "This is Judge Ellison." Mayor Cynthia Barker's voice came through, tight and controlled. "Judge, we need to talk. The city's on fire, and I don't need to tell you that your name is at the center of it." Ellison kept his tone even. "Then perhaps it's time the city faced the truth." There was a pause. Then, in a measured voice, the mayor said, "Meet me in my office in an hour." Ellison hung up, looking at Rachel. "Looks like things are about to get even more interesting." An hour later, he sat across from Mayor Barker in her sleek office, the city skyline stretching beyond the windows. She was a pragmatic woman, one who had built her career on walking political tightropes. And right now, she looked like she was trying to find her balance. "You've put us in a difficult position, Judge," she said, fingers tapping against her desk. Ellison didn't flinch. "I didn't put us here. The system did." She sighed, rubbing her temples. "Reynolds is a problem, I won't deny that. But you forced a conversation that a lot of people don't want to have." Ellison leaned forward. "Then maybe it's time they start listening." She studied him for a moment before nodding slowly. "The police chief is considering a full review of the department's handling of misconduct cases. If that happens, heads will roll. But there's pressure from the union, from conservative donors, from the governor's office itself to make this go away quietly." Ellison's gaze didn't waver. "I won't be silent." Mayor Barker sighed again. "Then neither will I." For the first time, Ellison saw something shift in her expression. Resignation, maybe. Or resolve. Outside, the protests continued. Inside, battle lines were being drawn. And as Judge Ellison left City Hall that afternoon, he knew one thing for certain: this fight was far from over. By the time Judge Ellison returned to the courthouse, the atmosphere inside had shifted. The building, usually a place of rigid order, felt unsteady, like a dam straining under pressure. The halls were filled with whispered conversations, glances exchanged over coffee cups, and a tension that clung to every interaction. Rachel was waiting for him outside his chambers, her arms crossed. "We've got another problem." Ellison sighed, removing his coat. "Of course we do." She handed him a tablet. "This just hit the news." He scanned the screen. A new report had surfaced. An anonymous whistleblower from within the police department had leaked additional documents. It wasn't just Reynolds. It was a pattern stretching back years. Cases dismissed, complaints ignored, officers protected despite overwhelming evidence of misconduct. Ellison set the tablet down carefully. "This changes everything." Rachel nodded. "It's an avalanche, Judge. The public is demanding action, and the mayor's office is scrambling." A knock at the door interrupted them. The bailiff poked his head in, looking uneasy. "Chief Reynolds is here to see you." Rachel stiffened. "Are you kidding me?" Ellison raised an eyebrow. "Not the officer, his father." The room went silent. Chief Daniel Reynolds had led the department for over a decade. He was known for being calculating, fiercely loyal to his officers, and resistant to change. Ellison exhaled. "Send him in." The door swung open, and Chief Reynolds stepped inside, his uniform crisp, his expression unreadable. He closed the door behind him and stood for a moment, studying Ellison. "Judge," he said finally, "we need to talk." Ellison gestured to a chair. "Then talk." Reynolds sat, his posture rigid. "I won't waste your time. The department is under siege. My officers are being vilified, and my son, well, you know his situation." Ellison remained impassive. "Your officers are being held accountable. As for your son, he did that to himself." Reynolds' jaw tightened. "We both know how this city works. There's pressure from the governor's office. The union powerful people want this handled quietly. I need to know where you stand." Ellison folded his hands. "I stand with the truth." The chief leaned forward. "That's noble, but truth doesn't always fit neatly into politics. If you push too hard, you won't just take down my son. You'll drag the entire department into the fire. Is that what you want?" Ellison didn't blink. "I want justice. If that means exposing a corrupt system, so be it." Reynolds exhaled sharply. "Then you should know, the department is already making moves. Officers are lawyering up. Some will talk, some will fight back, and some will try to take you down with them." Ellison held his gaze. "Let them try." The chief studied him for a long moment, then stood. "I hope you know what you're starting, Judge. Because once this begins, there's no stopping it. Ellison rose as well. It began the moment your officers decided they were above the law. Reynolds nodded once, then walked out, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. Rachel let out a breath. That man just threatened you. Ellison nodded slowly. Yes. And that means we're on the right path. As he looked out his office window at the protesters gathered below, Ellison knew the cracks in the system were widening. And soon, the whole thing would come crashing down. Judge Ellison barely had a moment to reflect before his phone rang. It was the mayor. I take it you saw the latest leak, Mayor Barker said without preamble. I did, Ellison replied, his voice calm. This has turned into a nightmare, she continued. Public trust in the police is in free fall. The union is up in arms, and I have a governor breathing down my neck, demanding that we restore order. Ellison didn't bother sugarcoating it. Then maybe it's time the city stops covering for officers who violate the law. The line went silent for a moment. We need to be careful, she said finally. This situation is volatile. No, Ellison corrected. This situation is justice catching up. She sighed. We're holding a press conference tomorrow. We have to take control of the narrative before it spirals further. I'd like you to be there. Ellison agreed, though he knew the event would be little more than political posturing. Still, he needed to be in the room where the decisions were made. That evening, Rachel Morales sat across from him in his office, reviewing notes. The chief wasn't bluffing, she said. Reynolds has lawyers working overtime, trying to suppress any further leaks. But the whistleblower isn't backing down. They're promising even more evidence, years of cover-ups, internal corruption. Ellison steepled his fingers. Which means we'll see more desperation from the other side. They'll try to discredit the leaks, attack the messenger. Rachel nodded grimly. And possibly come after you. He had considered that. A lifetime on the bench had given him a thick skin, but this was different. They weren't just playing politics anymore. This was survival for people who had wielded unchecked power for too long. The next morning, the press conference took place outside City Hall. Mayor Barker stood at the podium, flanked by city officials and police representatives. The crowd was a mix of reporters, protesters, and concerned citizens. When Ellison stepped forward, the murmurs grew louder. He spoke plainly. The events of this past week have exposed deep flaws in our system. We cannot claim to stand for justice while protecting those who abuse their power. Change is coming, whether some want it or not. A reporter called out, Judge, do you believe the department is beyond saving? Ellison met the question head-on. I believe an institution that refuses to reform will collapse under the weight of its own corruption. The press conference ended in chaos, with the police union president storming away from the podium. That night, as Ellison drove home, he noticed a black SUV in his rearview mirror, following him a little too closely. He exhaled, gripping the wheel. They were getting desperate. The days following the press conference were a whirlwind for Judge Ellison. The public outcry, both for and against him, had only intensified. Media outlets continued to pick apart every word he'd said, often twisting his remarks to fit their narratives. The pressure was mounting, but Ellison had long known that facing down injustice required an unwavering resolve. By midweek, the backlash had become personal. His office had received multiple threats, some vague, some direct, all of them ugly. The police union had issued a statement condemning his remarks, accusing him of undermining law enforcement and feeding into the rising tide of anti-police sentiment. But the judge wasn't one to be swayed by such rhetoric. If anything, it fueled his determination. Rachel sat across from him in his chambers, holding a stack of papers. This is getting out of hand. The unions turned the heat up. They're threatening to mobilize more support, and there's talk of a recall effort against you. Ellison looked at her, his expression unreadable. Let them try. Rachel's eyes widened. Judge, this is bigger than just a recall. They're aiming to discredit you completely. If they succeed, they'll send a message that no one in power is safe to challenge the status quo. I didn't start this fight to back down now, Ellison replied. And if I have to go down, I'll do it standing tall. She took a breath, considering his words. Then we need to make sure we're ready. The evidence we've got on Reynolds, on the department, it's solid. But if we don't act soon, the longer this drags on, the more it'll slip through our fingers. Ellison nodded. We'll take action. But we need to be strategic. The system is against us, but that's exactly why we can't afford to rush. Rachel was silent for a moment, then said quietly, I believe in what you're doing, Judge. But I can't help but feel like the storm is about to break, and we're standing right in the center of it. Ellison's gaze was firm. Then let the storm come. The next day, Ellison found himself at City Hall, standing in front of a room full of city council members. The mayor had called an emergency session, and though the topic of discussion was supposed to be the escalating crisis within the police department, the atmosphere in the room was anything but productive. It felt more like a powder keg waiting to explode. "Judge Ellison, thank you for joining us today," the mayor said, her voice tight as she sat at the head of the table. Ellison nodded, taking his place. The council members avoided looking directly at him, many too uncomfortable with the growing tension to speak. It was clear that most were waiting for someone else to make the first move. The mayor cleared her throat. "As you all know, the public is demanding action. This situation with Officer Reynolds has become untenable, and the police department's credibility is at stake. The city can no longer ignore the calls for reform." A council member, a middle-aged man with a conservative air about him, spoke up. "With all due respect, Mayor, isn't this just a matter of one rogue officer? Why are we treating this like it's a systemic issue?" The room fell silent. The question hung there, heavy with the implication that perhaps all the talk of reform was an overreaction. Ellison didn't hesitate. Because it's not just one officer. It's a department that has turned a blind eye to misconduct for years. It's a system that has been complicit in protecting bad actors, and it's time that we address that reality. There was a murmur around the table, and Ellison could feel the shift in the room. Some council members seemed uncomfortable, others seemed to agree with him, but no one was willing to speak up just yet. The mayor's face was unreadable. "Are you suggesting, Judge, that we take drastic measures, like a full review of the entire department?" one of the council members asked. Ellison met his gaze without flinching. "Yes, it's long overdue." The silence stretched, and for a moment, no one spoke. Then the mayor cleared her throat again. "I'll make the call for a full review. We'll work on a press release and Her words were cut off as the door to the council room suddenly burst open. The room froze. Standing in the doorway was Chief Daniel Reynolds, his face stormy, his presence commanding. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm afraid this conversation has gone far enough," he said, his voice low but laced with authority. The mayor's expression darkened. "Chief Reynolds, this is a private meeting." "No," Reynolds interrupted, stepping forward. "This is about the future of this department, and I'm not going to stand by while you dismantle it in front of a room full of people who don't understand the true nature of this job." Ellison stood up, his gaze unwavering. "And I won't stand by while your department continues to abuse its power and destroy lives." Reynolds' eyes narrowed, and for a moment, it looked like the room might explode into chaos. But before anyone could react, Ellison's phone buzzed. It was Rachel. His thumb swiped across the screen. "What is it?" "Judge, they've got Reynolds' personnel file. It's worse than we thought. We have to move now." Ellison glanced around the room, his resolve hardening. "Then it's time we made this storm official." The day of reckoning had arrived. Judge Ellison stood in front of the full courthouse, flanked by his colleagues, media cameras, and the public. It was a strange sort of circus, the air charged with anticipation. Today wasn't just about the case, it was about sending a message. A message that injustice, in any form, would not be tolerated. The story of Officer Reynolds, the false accusations against Ellison, and the subsequent fallout had unfolded like a storybook tragedy, full of anger, lies, and betrayal. But today was different. Today, the final pieces would fall into place. Ellison had spent the last few days meticulously preparing, reviewing the evidence Rachel had gathered, speaking to those willing to come forward, and ensuring the truth was airtight. There was no more room for doubt. He knew what he had to do, even if it meant making personal sacrifices. The courtroom was packed. The tension hung thick, like smoke from a fire that had yet to be put out. Media outlets had stationed their cameras, eager for any sign of drama. The walls, usually calm and formal, now felt like the battleground of a political war. Rachel had been his backbone throughout it all, and as she walked into the courtroom, her expression was resolute. She handed Ellison a folder containing the final pieces of evidence, each one a dagger in Reynolds' defense. This was the moment that would expose the truth. The moment that would break the dam of corruption, exposing the rotten core of the system that had allowed Reynolds, and others like him, to operate unchecked for far too long. Ellison glanced at her. "Are we ready?" She nodded, her eyes sharp. "More than ready. We have everything we need." He took a deep breath. "Then let's begin." As the judge made his way to the bench, his gavel felt like an anchor in his hand, solid, steady, yet heavy with responsibility. He called the session to order, his voice cutting through the murmur of the courtroom. The moment had arrived to confront not only the lies told about him, but also the years of power abuses hidden behind the walls of the department. The case against Officer Reynolds was about to unfold in its full, grim detail. Rachel stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor, members of the jury, today we bring the truth to light. This case is not just about one officer. This is about the corruption that has been allowed to fester within the very department tasked with serving and protecting the people of this city." She paused for a moment, letting the words settle, before continuing. "The defendant, Officer Reynolds, has been complicit in a pattern of misconduct spanning over a decade. From false arrests, the destruction of evidence, and using his badge as a tool to intimidate and harass innocent civilians, this case is about shining a light on the systemic failure that allowed him to thrive. This is about holding him accountable for the actions that have ruined lives." Ellison watched as the jury, some looking uncomfortable, others looking determined, took in her words. The media had their cameras trained on the proceedings, and the weight of the room was palpable. They were not just observing, they were witnessing history in the making. Reynolds, who had once walked into the courtroom with arrogance, now sat slumped in his chair, his face pale. The fear in his eyes was evident. This was no longer a matter of saving face or spinning a narrative. This was the end of the road. Rachel continued, detailing the damning evidence. She brought forward testimonies from former colleagues, whistleblowers from the police department, and even former victims of Reynolds' misconduct. Each person who spoke painted a picture of a man who had operated above the law, confident that his badge would shield him from consequence. Ellison could see the shift happening before his eyes. The walls of denial were crumbling, brick by brick. For years, Reynolds had been allowed to act with impunity. Today, however, the truth had come crashing down. The defense tried to counter with weak arguments, pulling at straws and making desperate claims that Reynolds had been misunderstood. But Ellison wasn't buying it. Every word from the defense felt hollow, a weak attempt to cover up the undeniable truth laid bare before them. As the trial came to a close, Ellison stood, his voice calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the evidence has been presented. The truth is clear. Officer Reynolds has abused the trust of this city, and he will face the consequences of his actions." The gavel came down with a heavy thud, signaling the end of the trial. The court erupted in a flurry of noise, the media pushing forward to get their sound bites, the public reacting in a mix of relief and disbelief. For the first time in a long time, it felt like justice had been served. But this was just the beginning. In the days following the trial, as Reynolds was led away in handcuffs, his reputation in tatters, Ellison couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet satisfaction. The battle had been long and hard, but it had been worth it. The media had covered the trial in all its intensity, and the story would live on long after the courtroom doors had closed. As for the police department, the fallout was inevitable. Reforms were swiftly put into place, and investigations into other officers began immediately. Chief Reynolds, who had once been so confident in his power, had already been forced into retirement amidst the scandal. The department was shaken to its core, but a change had been set in motion, and no one could deny that it was for the better. Ellison sat in his chambers, looking out over the city. It was a city that had tested him, that had pushed him to his limits, but it was also a city that had been given a second chance to heal. And as he sat there, reflecting on everything that had transpired, he knew one thing for certain: the fight wasn't over. There would always be more battles to face, more injustices to right. But today he had won. Today, justice had prevailed. The gavel was still in his hand, and with it, he would continue to deliver justice. Always.